Carter Jenkins, a successful black entrepreneur, finds his life interrupted during a routine drive home when a tense encounter with Officer Jason White brings to light issues far deeper than either man could have anticipated. With a viral video capturing the incident and the public demanding answers, both men are thrust into a whirlwind of scrutiny, justice, and introspection. What happens when the pursuit of accountability collides with personal reckoning? Subscribe to the channel and follow along to see how this powerful story unfolds. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Carter Jenkins tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he eased his silver sedan out of the brightly lit office parking garage. The glow of the fluorescent lights gave way to the velvet darkness of the late evening, the city alive with flickering streetlights and the occasional hum of passing cars. He glanced at his watch. It was 9:37 p.m., later than he intended to leave, but the meeting had been important. The client was impressed with his pitch, and as an independent business consultant, Carter knew the significance of leaving a lasting impression. He adjusted the air conditioning and rolled his shoulders, trying to shake off the lingering fatigue of the day. His mind began to wander, not to his accomplishments or the contracts waiting to be signed, but to his upcoming weekend plans with his niece. The image of her delighted face when he promised a trip to the amusement park brought a rare smile to his lips. Life wasn't always easy, but moments like those made the struggles worth it. Carter's car hummed steadily as he turned onto a quieter stretch of road lined with closed storefronts and the occasional dimly lit diner. The solitude of the drive was a welcome reprieve after the long day. He reached for the radio dial, settling on a station playing smooth jazz. The soft, melancholic notes filled the car, matching the rhythm of his thoughts. Further downtown, Officer Jason White leaned against the hood of his patrol car, the soft glow of the street lamp casting sharp shadows on his angular face. His shift had been as uneventful as most nights in this part of town, a monotonous pattern of cruising through streets and responding to minor disturbances. He stretched his neck, rolling it from side to side, the weight of another thankless shift pressing on him. Jason ran a hand through his neatly cropped blonde hair, scanning the street with a mixture of boredom and contempt. This neighborhood wasn't his beat by choice. It had been assigned after what his captain diplomatically referred to as an incident. He knew what they all thought: he was brash, overly aggressive. Jason preferred to think of himself as efficient. If that meant stepping on a few toes, so be it. You didn't enforce order by playing nice. A low rumble of an approaching car drew Jason's attention. His gaze locked onto the gleam of headlights approaching from the east, the vehicle moving smoothly at a steady pace. Silver sedan, clean exterior, nothing unusual. But then Jason's mind began to work in familiar patterns, fueled by years of ingrained bias and assumptions. It's late, he thought. Why is a car like that out here? Jason slid into his cruiser, his movements deliberate. The engine roared to life as he pulled out of the parking space and onto the road, keeping a calculated distance behind the silver car. He let the patrol lights remain off for now, observing the vehicle as it approached an intersection. The driver's movements were calm and measured. Jason's jaw tightened. "Let's see what you're up to," he muttered under his breath. Unaware of the gaze fixed on him, Carter hummed softly along with the radio, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel in time with the music. He signaled to turn left and glanced into his rearview mirror. A flash of red and blue lights immediately caused his chest to tighten. The cruiser's lights flared to life as the siren gave a brief wail before settling into an ominous rhythm. Carter's stomach sank. He knew this moment all too well, the feeling of being singled out, the questions, the unspoken accusations. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm as he signaled and pulled his car to the side of the road. The jazz on the radio suddenly seemed distant, drowned out by the sound of his heart pounding in his ears. Jason parked the cruiser a few feet behind the sedan, leaving his headlights on to illuminate the scene. He adjusted his belt and took a deep breath before stepping out. His boots hit the pavement with a measured thud as he approached the driver's side window, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. Carter lowered his window, the cool night air rushing into the car. His eyes met Jason's as he forced a polite smile. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Carter asked, his tone calm but firm. Jason squinted slightly, scanning Carter's face. A neatly trimmed beard, a crisp white shirt, and a tie loosened around his neck. The man didn't look like trouble, but Jason's instincts told him to dig deeper. license and registration, Jason replied brusquely, ignoring the question. Carter nodded and reached into the glove compartment for his registration. He moved deliberately, aware of how even the slightest quick motion could be misinterpreted. After retrieving the documents, he handed them to Jason along with his license. Jason took them without a word, his eyes narrowing as he examined the documents under the glow of his flashlight. Carter's license showed a local address. He wasn't some outsider passing through, but that didn't ease Jason's suspicions. He glanced at Carter again. "What brings you out here tonight?" Jason asked, his voice sharp. "I'm heading home from work," Carter replied evenly. "Just finished a meeting with a client." Jason nodded slowly, but his expression remained guarded. "And where do you work?" Carter's patience began to thin. He knew this wasn't a casual inquiry, it was a fishing expedition. Still, he kept his tone measured. "I run my own consulting business. I was meeting with a client downtown." Jason raised an eyebrow. "A consultant, huh? Pretty late for a meeting, don't you think?" Carter met Jason's gaze, his own steady and unwavering. "Clients don't always work 9 to 5, officer." Jason pursed his lips, annoyed by Carter's calm demeanor. He stepped back, casting his flashlight beam across the car's interior. Briefcase on the passenger seat, neatly folded jacket, nothing out of place. It was all too neat, too perfect. He felt his authority slipping. Jason walked back to his cruiser, the irritation gnawing at him. Sitting inside, he keyed in Carter's license number, hoping to find anything that justified this stop. When nothing came up, his frustration grew. He turned his gaze back to the sedan, his mind racing. Carter, meanwhile, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching Jason's shadowed figure in the patrol car. This wasn't the first time he'd been stopped for no reason, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But each encounter left a scar, a reminder of the biases he couldn't outrun. Jason emerged from the cruiser, his steps quick and forceful. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Carter's heart sank. "Why? Have I done something wrong?" Jason's expression hardened. "Step out of the car, sir." With a resigned sigh, Carter unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. He stepped out, his movements deliberate, his posture composed. He stood tall, his eyes meeting Jason's with quiet defiance. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Jason barked. Carter hesitated for a moment before complying. The cold metal of the car's hood pressed against his palms as Jason began to pat him down. It wasn't just humiliating, it was infuriating. But Carter held his tongue, knowing that speaking out could escalate the situation. Jason finished the search and stepped back, his frustration mounting. There was nothing, no weapon, no drugs, nothing suspicious. But instead of admitting defeat, he pointed to the back seat. "Mind if I take a look in there?" Carter turned slowly, his expression firm. "Yes, officer, I do mind. You don't have the right to search my car." Jason's jaw tightened. The night was far from over. Jason White stood frozen for a moment, Carter's refusal hanging heavy in the air. The tension between them crackled like static electricity, each man sizing the other up in silence. Jason wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by someone who didn't fit neatly into his preconceived notions. This was supposed to be routine, an easy assertion of authority, but Carter's calm defiance rattled him. "I'll need you to step back and wait by the curb," Jason finally said, his voice tight. "For my safety." Carter folded his arms across his chest. "Officer, I've cooperated fully. I've given you my license, registration, and explained where I'm coming from. Now, if you're not going to tell me what this stop is about, I'd like to leave." Jason's face reddened. He wasn't used to people speaking to him with such confidence. "I'm conducting an investigation. You'll stand by the curb while I confirm everything." Carter's jaw clenched, but he held his ground. "With all due respect, you've had my information for several minutes. If there was a problem, I assume you would have told me by now." Jason bristled at the words. He felt the control of the situation slipping further with each passing second. He leaned closer, his tone sharp and condescending. "You don't get to decide how long I take. Stand by the curb, now." Carter hesitated but decided it wasn't worth escalating further. He stepped back, standing by the curb with his arms at his sides, his posture rigid. Jason exhaled, relieved at regaining a sliver of control. He approached the patrol car again, the dim glow of the dashboard casting his face in sharp relief. His fingers hovered over the keyboard of his onboard computer, but his mind was elsewhere. Why does he have to act so righteous? Jason thought bitterly. The man's clean-cut appearance and articulate manner had thrown him off balance, challenging the assumptions he leaned on to navigate these stops. It was supposed to be simple: assert control, dig up something suspicious, and close the case. But Carter's composure made him feel exposed, as if he were the one on trial. The patrol car's computer remained unhelpful, the search on Carter's license and plates coming up clean. No priors, no arrests, not even a speeding ticket. Jason leaned back in his seat, rubbing his temples. This should have been over by now. Glancing up, Jason noticed Carter standing under the faint glow of a street lamp, his shadow long and distorted against the pavement. He looked calm, but Jason could sense the simmering tension beneath his exterior. It gnawed at him. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car, the beam cutting through the night as he approached Carter again. "Are you carrying anything I should know about?" Jason asked, shining the light into Carter's eyes. Carter flinched at the brightness but kept his voice steady. "No, officer. I told you I'm just heading home." Jason lowered the flashlight slightly but didn't back down. "Mind explaining why you're in this part of town?" Carter's patience wore thinner. "I wasn't aware this area required an explanation." Jason smirked, the edge of his frustration surfacing. "People don't usually drive through here late at night unless they're up to something. You can see why I'd ask." Carter let out a slow breath. "No, officer, I don't see why you'd ask. My route home takes me this way, that's all." Jason was about to retort when the crackle of his radio interrupted. He reached for it, turning slightly away from Carter as the dispatcher relayed a minor incident nearby, a noise complaint on the other side of town. Jason's fingers hovered over the radio, tempted to pass the responsibility off to another unit, but he hesitated. "Copy that," he replied into the radio. "I'll respond once I'm clear here." He clipped the radio back to his belt, his irritation mounting. The night was getting away from him. If he let Carter go now, he'd feel like he'd lost something intangible but vital, a sense of control, of authority. But if he stayed, it might make things worse. Jason turned back to Carter, who now looked at him with quiet exasperation. "You've had plenty of time to run your checks. Is there a reason I'm still standing here?" The question struck a nerve. Jason's mind scrambled for a way to reassert dominance, to prolong the interaction without making it obvious he was fishing. His gaze fell to the car and the documents Carter had provided earlier. Maybe there was something he'd missed. "I'm going to take another look at your registration," Jason said. "Wait here." Carter watched as Jason retrieved the paperwork from the patrol car. He suppressed the urge to say anything, knowing it would only give Jason an excuse to escalate. Instead, he crossed his arms and let his gaze wander to the quiet street. A lone pedestrian passed by on the opposite sidewalk, glancing over with a mix of curiosity and unease before quickening their pace. Carter felt a pang of resentment at how routine this all seemed, how familiar, how predictable. Jason examined the documents again, his frustration mounting. They were perfectly in order, with no signs of tampering or irregularities. Yet something about Carter's unshakable calm infuriated him. It was as though the man was mocking him without saying a word. A sudden thought crossed Jason's mind, reckless and irrational. He stepped closer to the sedan and shone his flashlight through the windows. "Pop the trunk," he said curtly. Carter's brows furrowed. "Excuse me." Jason straightened his posture, his hand drifting toward his belt. "You heard me. Pop the trunk." "I haven't given you permission to search my car," Carter replied evenly. "And unless you have probable cause, I believe I'm within my rights to decline." Jason's jaw tightened, his frustration boiling over. "You can make this easy, or you can make it difficult. It's your call." Carter met Jason's glare with steady defiance. "I've done nothing wrong, officer. This stop has gone far enough." The tension between them thickened, the quiet street amplifying the charged silence. Jason knew he was on shaky ground but couldn't bring himself to back down. The idea of walking away, of letting Carter win, was unbearable. He felt the weight of his badge, the authority it represented, slipping from his grasp. Jason's mind raced for justification, for anything that would validate his actions. That's when he remembered the laptop in his patrol car, connected to the police database. With it, he could access more than just traffic violations. He could dig into sealed records, employment histories, and even financial backgrounds. It was risky, and he knew it crossed a line, but his pride outweighed his reason. "I'll be right back," Jason said abruptly, turning on his heel and striding back to his cruiser. He slid into the driver's seat, shutting the door with more force than necessary. His hands hovered over the keyboard, his conscience warring with his need to prove himself. As the screen loaded, Jason typed in Carter's name and other details from his license. He scrolled through the results, his pulse quickening. Most of the entries were mundane parking tickets, vehicle registrations, nothing that justified the stop. But then his eyes landed on a sealed personnel file, its title cryptic but intriguing. A few keystrokes bypassed the security measures and the file opened. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The document wasn't about Carter, not directly. It detailed an investigation into misconduct within the department, an investigation that implicated Jason himself. The words blurred as his mind reeled, the implications hitting him like a freight train. He scrolled further, his hands trembling. Attached to the file was a memo addressed to Carter, identifying him as a consultant hired to audit police practices. Jason's stomach churned as he realized the man he'd been harassing was part of the very process that could end his career. Outside, Carter shifted his weight, glancing back at the patrol car. Jason's silhouette was barely visible behind the glare of the dashboard lights. Carter's patience had worn thin, but he kept his frustration in check. He had a sinking feeling this was far from over. Inside the cruiser, Jason's face was pale, his mind racing for a way out. He felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him, the reckless choices that had led him here. He slammed the laptop shut and gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Carter glanced over his shoulder as Jason stepped out of the patrol car, his expression unreadable. The balance of power had shifted, though neither man fully understood the extent of it yet. "Here's your paperwork," Jason said tersely, thrusting the documents toward Carter. "You're free to go." Carter hesitated, sensing something was amiss, but took the papers without comment. He got back into his car, his movements deliberate. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of Jason standing rigid by the patrol car, his shadow cast long and distorted in the harsh headlights. The night wasn't over for Jason White. It was only beginning. Jason White sat in the driver's seat of his patrol car, still gripping the steering wheel as if it might steady the chaos swirling in his mind. The laptop sat closed on the center console, but the contents of the sealed file replayed in his head like a damning verdict. Every word, every detail screamed of his own professional doom. He clenched his jaw and shut his eyes, but he couldn't shake the sickening feeling of exposure. The sealed document had laid out an internal investigation into systemic misconduct within the police department. It named multiple officers, outlining allegations of racial profiling, illegal searches, and even tampering with evidence. Jason's name wasn't just mentioned, it was bolded in black ink, underlined in a list of officers facing potential termination. Carter Jenkins's role as a consultant in the audit made the interaction between them not just unfortunate, but explosive. Jason gritted his teeth, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He had thought himself untouchable. Years of bending the rules had made him feel invincible. But this was a reckoning waiting to happen. And it wasn't just Carter's calm defiance that had unnerved him. It was the realization that this man held the power to dismantle his career. Jason's radio crackled to life, jolting him out of his spiraling thoughts. A dispatcher's voice broke the tense silence, calling for nearby units to respond to a minor traffic incident a few blocks away. Jason instinctively reached for the radio to acknowledge, but his hand froze midway. His mind wasn't on his job anymore. It was on the man he had just let drive away Carter Jenkins. The flicker of taillights disappeared in the distance, and Jason's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. He had let Carter go, but not because he wanted to. He had let him go because he didn't know what else to do. Jason's thoughts snapped back to the sealed file. Why would someone like Carter have access to it, and how could it connect to him so directly? The questions ate at him, fanning the flames of paranoia. For the first time in years, Jason felt powerless, a sinking sensation that made his badge feel heavier than ever. Carter drove down the empty street, the silence in the car punctuated only by the rhythmic thrum of his tires against the pavement. His hands trembled slightly on the wheel, the remnants of adrenaline from his interaction with Jason still coursing through his veins. He had kept his composure during the stop, but now, away from the suffocating gaze of the officer, he allowed himself to exhale fully. The encounter had been more than just frustrating. It was another painful reminder of the systemic biases he and countless others faced. But Carter wasn't the type to dwell in anger. He was a man of action, someone who believed in dismantling injustice piece by piece, even if the process felt unbearably slow. This wasn't the first time he had dealt with racial profiling, but the stakes had never felt so personal. As a consultant working with civil rights organizations, Carter had been tasked with examining police practices in cities across the state. The sealed file Jason accessed was part of his ongoing work, a confidential audit to expose officers who abused their power. Carter hadn't anticipated becoming a target of the very system he was trying to reform. Not tonight, not like this. His phone buzzed in the cup holder, pulling him out of his thoughts. Carter glanced down and saw a name flash across the screen: Angela Robinson. She was one of the attorneys overseeing the audit, a sharp, relentless advocate who had worked tirelessly to hold police departments accountable. He grabbed the phone and answered, his voice steady despite the lingering tension. "Hey, Angela." "Carter, are you okay?" Her voice was brisk, tinged with concern. "I saw the video." Carter frowned, his brow furrowing. "What video?" There was a brief pause, and Carter could hear the faint click of a keyboard in the background. "Someone recorded your traffic stop. It's online, and it's gaining traction fast. I just sent you the link." Carter's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," Angela replied. "The officer White, I think. He comes off as aggressive and unprofessional. People are already commenting on the racial undertones. The footage ends before anything escalates, but it's clear he had no valid reason to stop you." Carter's chest tightened. He had noticed a bystander lingering nearby, their phone raised, but he hadn't realized they were recording. He pulled over to the side of the road and opened the link Angela sent. The video played, shaky but clear enough to capture Jason's confrontational demeanor and Carter's calm responses. "This could be a turning point," Angela said, her voice firm. "If this goes viral, we can use it to push the department harder. Public pressure could accelerate the audit." Carter rubbed his temple, the weight of the situation settling on him. "And what happens to White?" "That depends," Angela said. "If he's part of the misconduct we're investigating, this might be the final nail in the coffin. But that's a big if we need more evidence to connect him to the systemic issues." Carter exhaled deeply, his thoughts a whirlwind. "Angela, I need some time to think about this. I don't want to make a move until I'm sure." "Of course," she replied, her tone softening. "But Carter, be careful. If he realizes who you are, things could get ugly." Carter ended the call and sat in silence, the weight of Angela's words heavy on his shoulders. He knew she was right. Jason White wasn't just any officer. He was a symptom of a larger disease, and Carter had unwittingly become a piece of the puzzle to dismantle it. Back at the precinct, Jason sat at his desk, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. The sealed file haunted him, its contents flashing in his mind like a neon warning sign. He hadn't told anyone about what he'd seen, but he could feel the walls closing in around him. His phone buzzed, and he glanced down to see a message from his colleague, Officer Mark Daniels. "Mark, you see this yet?" Jason frowned, his fingers hovering over the screen. He clicked the link Mark had sent, and his heart sank. It was the video of the traffic stop, the footage grainy but damning. The comments below it were scathing, accusing Jason of racial profiling and abusing his authority. His pulse quickened as he read the words, "Typical cop, how long until this guy is put on leave? We've had enough of this." Jason threw his phone onto the desk, his chest heaving. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had dealt with public scrutiny before, but this felt different. It wasn't just the video, it was the context, the looming audit, the sealed file. The puzzle pieces were coming together, and the picture they painted wasn't in his favor. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. There was only one way out of this: to get ahead of the narrative, to control the story before it controlled him. But to do that, he needed leverage, and that leverage was Carter Jenkins. Jason's hands moved to his laptop, his fingers flying over the keyboard. He pulled up Carter's information again, scrolling through every detail he could find. His address, his work history, his social connections, it was all there. Jason's gaze hardened as a plan began to form. If Carter wanted to expose him, Jason would make sure the fight wasn't one-sided. The following day dawned quietly for Carter Jenkins, but the events of the previous night lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. As sunlight streamed through his apartment windows, Carter sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. The video of his traffic stop had continued to gain traction overnight. Comments poured in, amplifying public outrage and putting a spotlight on Jason White's conduct. He couldn't help but feel conflicted. Part of him welcomed the attention. It wasn't often that incidents like these reached such a wide audience. But another part of him worried about the consequences, not for himself, but for the broader goals of the audit. If this became solely about his encounter, it might overshadow the systemic issues he was trying to address. The sound of his phone buzzing snapped him out of his thoughts. It was Angela again. "Morning, Angela," Carter said, his voice steady. "Carter, we need to talk," Angela said without preamble. "I've been going through the comments on the video, and it's clear people are demanding action. This could push the department to release an official statement, or they might go after you to deflect attention." Carter sighed. "You think they'll come after me?" Angela hesitated. "They might. Jason White seems like the type to retaliate. I don't think he knows your role in the audit yet, but if he finds out, it could get messy." Carter leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "I've dealt with guys like him before. He's loud, aggressive, but predictable. If he comes at me, I'll handle it." Angela's voice softened. "Just be careful. This isn't just about you anymore. This video has the potential to expose something much bigger. We need to stay ahead of it." "I hear you," Carter said. "But for now, I'm sticking to my plan. I've got a meeting with one of the audit leads later today. I'll let you know how it goes." "Good. Keep me posted," Angela said before hanging up. Carter placed his phone on the table and stared at it for a moment. He knew Angela was right. This wasn't just about him. The stakes were higher than ever, and every decision he made moving forward could tip the scales in one direction or another. Across town, Jason White paced the length of his small living room, his mind racing. He had spent the morning combing through Carter's file again, searching for anything he could use to discredit him. So far, his efforts had yielded nothing. Carter's record was spotless, his professional background unimpeachable. Jason's frustration boiled over as he slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the coffee mug perched precariously on the edge. The video of their encounter was everywhere, the comments tearing him apart. Words like racist abuser and unfit to serve rang in his ears. He couldn't let this ruin him, not when his career was already hanging by a thread. His phone buzzed on the counter, and he snatched it up. It was Mark Daniels, his colleague. What Jason snapped, not bothering with pleasantries. "Hey, chill out," Mark said. "I just wanted to give you a heads up. That video? It's gaining traction with some reporters. They're sniffing around the precinct, asking questions about you." Jason's stomach twisted. "Reporters? What kind of questions?" "About your record, mostly," Mark said. "But I heard something else. They're saying the guy in the video, Carter Jenkins, might be tied to that audit thing." Jason froze. "Audit?" "Yeah, the one they've been talking about in the higher-ups meetings. Jenkins is some kind of consultant working on it." Jason's grip on the phone tightened. He felt the ground shift beneath him, the implications crashing down like a wave. Carter wasn't just some random guy he'd pulled over. He was part of the very process that could end Jason's career. "Thanks for the tip," Jason said, his voice cold. He ended the call without waiting for a reply. Jason sat down heavily on the couch, his mind racing. He needed to act fast. If Carter was involved in the audit, then he had the power to destroy Jason's career. But Jason wasn't going to go down without a fight. He needed to find a way to discredit Carter, to make him seem untrustworthy. And he needed to do it now. Later that afternoon, Carter arrived at the downtown office of the civil rights organization overseeing the audit. The building was modest but professional, its unassuming exterior belying the important work being done within its walls. Carter walked through the glass doors and greeted the receptionist with a warm smile. "Hi, I'm here to see Victor Martinez," he said. The receptionist nodded and directed him to a conference room on the second floor. Carter made his way up the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. When he entered the conference room, he found Victor already waiting for him. The older man, with his salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes, greeted Carter with a firm handshake. "Carter, good to see you," Victor said, gesturing for him to sit. "I've been following the situation with your traffic stop. How are you holding up?" "I'm managing," Carter said. "But I won't lie, it's been a lot to process." Victor nodded. "I can imagine. That video has put a lot of attention on you, but it's also put a spotlight on the broader issues we're trying to address. This could be an opportunity, Carter." "I've been thinking the same thing," Carter said. "But I'm worried about what comes next. Jason White, he's not the type to let this go." Victor leaned forward, his expression serious. "Then we need to be proactive. If he retaliates, we need to be ready. Do you have any evidence that could tie him to the misconduct we're investigating?" Carter hesitated. "I don't have anything concrete yet, but I know he accessed sealed files during the stop. He must have seen something that shook him." Victor's eyes narrowed. "That's significant. If he accessed those files illegally, it's a clear abuse of power. We can use that." "I thought about that," Carter said. "But I want to make sure we handle this the right way. I don't want to give him an excuse to play the victim." Victor smiled faintly. "You're a smart man, Carter. That's why we brought you on board. But don't forget, you're not in this alone. We're here to support you." Carter nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "Thanks, Victor. I'll keep you updated on anything I find." As Carter left the office, he felt a sense of clarity. The path ahead was daunting, but he knew what needed to be done. He would hold Jason White accountable, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced by the system. Jason, meanwhile, sat in his cruiser outside a nondescript coffee shop, his laptop open on the dashboard. He had spent the past hour scouring social media and online databases, searching for anything he could use against Carter. His desperation had reached a fever pitch, and his judgment was clouded by paranoia. Finally, he found something. An old blog post from years ago written by Carter during his college days. The post was critical of law enforcement, calling for widespread reforms and describing personal experiences with racial profiling. Jason's lips curled into a smirk. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He saved the post and began drafting an anonymous email to a local journalist. The email included the blog post and a fabricated claim that Carter was biased against police officers. Jason knew it wasn't ethical, but he didn't care. He was fighting for his survival. As he hit send, Jason leaned back in his seat, a grim satisfaction settling over him. He had taken the first step in turning the tide. But deep down, a part of him knew this wasn't over. Carter wasn't just an opponent, he was a symbol of everything Jason had spent his career ignoring. And Jason was about to learn that symbols didn't go down easily. The fallout from the viral video was immediate and relentless. By the time the weekend rolled around, Carter Jenkins found himself at the center of a whirlwind of media attention. News outlets, civil rights organizations, and even local politicians had taken an interest in his story. But it wasn't just his. The video of Jason White's misconduct had reignited long-simmering tensions about racial profiling and police accountability. Carter sat in the living room of his modest apartment, a steaming cup of coffee untouched on the table before him. His phone buzzed constantly with calls, texts, and notifications, but he ignored most of them. The relentless scrutiny made him uneasy. It wasn't the first time he'd been in the public eye. His consulting work often required a certain level of visibility, but this was different. This was deeply personal. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Carter hesitated for a moment before getting up. When he opened the door, he found Angela Robinson standing there, a leather satchel slung over her shoulder and an expression of weary determination on her face. "Angela," Carter said, stepping aside to let her in. "I wasn't expecting you." "I figured we should talk in person," Angela said, brushing past him and setting her satchel on the coffee table. "Things are escalating." Carter nodded grimly. "I noticed." Angela opened her satchel and pulled out a tablet, placing it on the table between them. She tapped the screen, pulling up an article from a local news site. The headline read, "Anti-police blogger behind viral video exposed." Carter's stomach dropped as he scanned the article. It included quotes from the blog post he had written years ago during college, calling for police reform. The article painted him as a radical, implying that his criticism of law enforcement made him untrustworthy. Jason White, Carter asked, though he already knew the answer. Angela nodded. We traced the anonymous email to a server that routes through the police department's network. It wasn't hard to figure out who sent it. Carter's jaw tightened. He had anticipated retaliation, but seeing it play out like this was another matter entirely. What's the damage? Public opinion is divided, Angela said. Some people see through it and recognize this as a smear campaign, but others are eating it up. The narrative is shifting, and we can't afford to lose control of it. Carter leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. What's our next move? Angela leaned forward, her eyes sharp. We go on the offensive. I've spoken to Victor and the rest of the team. We're going to file a formal complaint against Jason White for accessing those sealed files during the traffic stop. That alone is enough to launch an investigation. Carter frowned. And what happens after that? He gets a slap on the wrist? Maybe a suspension? Meanwhile, the department continues to operate the same way it always has. Angela placed a hand on his arm, her voice softening. This is bigger than Jason White, Carter. If we expose him, it'll force the department to confront the systemic issues that allowed him to act this way. This isn't just about punishing him, it's about changing the system. Carter exhaled slowly. He knew she was right, but the weight of the fight ahead felt overwhelming. All right, he said finally. Let's do it. At the precinct, Jason White was in survival mode. The video of the traffic stop had reached the upper echelons of the department, and whispers of an internal investigation were spreading like wildfire. Jason's colleagues avoided him, their sidelong glances and hushed conversations betraying their unease. He could feel the walls closing in, and his paranoia grew by the hour. He sat at his desk, scrolling through Carter's social media profiles, looking for anything he could use to discredit him further. His desperation was palpable, and his actions had become reckless. He knew he was playing with fire, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. White, a voice barked from across the bullpen. Jason looked up to see Captain Reardon standing in the doorway of his office, his expression unreadable. Jason swallowed hard and got to his feet, walking toward the captain's office with a sense of impending doom. Close the door, Reardon said as Jason stepped inside. Jason complied, his heart pounding. He sat down across from Reardon, who regarded him with a steely gaze. You know why you're here, Reardon said, leaning back in his chair. Jason nodded. The video. That, and the complaint we just received, Reardon said. He slid a folder across the desk toward Jason. Jenkins is alleging you accessed sealed files during the stop. Care to explain? Jason's mouth went dry. He opened the folder and scanned the contents, his mind racing for an excuse. I thought the file might have information relevant to the stop, he said finally. I was acting in good faith. Reardon's expression didn't change. Good faith doesn't include violating department policy. This is serious, White. If these allegations are substantiated, you're looking at termination. Jason's hands balled into fists under the desk. It's his word against mine, he said, his voice tight. There's no proof. Reardon sighed, rubbing his temples. White, there's more than enough to warrant an investigation. And given your record, you're not exactly in a position to defend yourself. Jason's stomach churned. He felt the weight of his past actions bearing down on him, every corner he had cut, every line he had crossed. It was all catching up to him. You're on administrative leave. Effective immediately, Reardon said. Turn in your badge and gun. Jason's breath caught in his throat. Captain, please. This isn't up for debate, Reardon said sharply. We'll notify you of the outcome of the investigation. Jason stood slowly, his mind reeling. He unfastened his badge and gun belt, placing them on the desk with trembling hands. As he left the office, he felt the eyes of his colleagues on him, their expressions a mix of pity and disdain. That evening, Carter attended a community meeting at a local church, organized by the civil rights group overseeing the audit. The room was packed with people from all walks of life, activists, concerned citizens, and even a few police reform advocates. The atmosphere buzzed with a mix of hope and urgency. Carter stood at the front of the room, addressing the crowd with a calm but passionate demeanor. "This isn't just about one bad cop," he said. "It's about a system that allows people like Jason White to operate without accountability, a system that targets people like me simply for existing." The audience murmured in agreement, their faces reflecting a shared determination. Angela stood off to the side, nodding as Carter spoke. She had seen him grow into a powerful advocate over the years, but tonight he seemed more resolute than ever. "We have an opportunity here," Carter continued. "An opportunity to demand change not just for ourselves but for future generations. But we can't do it alone. It's going to take all of us, working together, to make this happen." The room erupted in applause, and Carter felt a surge of hope. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that they might actually succeed. Jason sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the weight of his suspension pressing down on him like a physical force. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, but he ignored it. The world outside felt distant, his once powerful position reduced to a memory. He stared at the television, which was tuned to a news channel covering the community meeting. Carter's face filled the screen as he spoke passionately about accountability and reform. Jason's jaw tightened as he watched, his frustration boiling over. He grabbed the remote and turned off the TV, plunging the room into silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. For Jason White, the breaking point had come and gone. Now, he was left to face the consequences of his actions and the growing realization that the world he had taken for granted was changing with or without him. Carter Jenkins walked briskly through the halls of the Civil Rights Organization's office, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. The energy in the building was palpable, a mix of determination and anticipation as the staff prepared for the formal filing of their case against Jason White. Carter carried a leather-bound folder containing critical evidence statements, records, and the video footage of his traffic stop, all compiled into a damning narrative of misconduct. Angela Robinson met him in the conference room, where the audit team was gathered around a long table strewn with papers and laptops. She gestured for Carter to sit beside her, her expression both serious and reassuring. "Everything's ready," Angela said, tapping the folder in Carter's hands. "This is airtight. Once we file this, the department won't have any wiggle room. Jason White's actions are indefensible." Carter exhaled slowly. He knew Angela was right, but the weight of what they were about to do was heavy. It wasn't just about Jason White, it was about shining a light on an entire system built on unchecked power and systemic bias. Victor Martinez, the director of the audit team, leaned forward. "The media's going to eat this up. We've got several outlets ready to break the story as soon as we file. This is going to hit them hard." Angela nodded. "Carter, are you sure you're ready for this? Once this goes public, there's no turning back." Carter met her gaze, his voice steady. "I've been ready for this my whole life." Meanwhile, Jason White sat in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city, nursing his third whiskey of the evening. The bar was nearly empty, save for a few regulars hunched over their drinks. The air was thick with the scent of stale alcohol and despair. Jason stared into his glass, his mind replaying the events of the past week. The suspension, the public scrutiny, the whispers among his colleagues, it all felt like a slow-motion implosion. He was no stranger to controversy, but this time was different. This time there was no way out. His phone buzzed on the bar, but he ignored it. He knew it would be another message from Mark or one of his other colleagues, offering half-hearted support or asking for updates he didn't have. He couldn't bring himself to face them, not when he felt so utterly exposed. Jason's thoughts turned to Carter Jenkins. The man had become a symbol of everything Jason despised: resistance, accountability, and a refusal to bow to authority. But as much as Jason hated to admit it, there was a part of him that recognized the truth in Carter's defiance. Jason had crossed a line, and deep down he knew it. The bartender approached, refilling Jason's glass without a word. Jason muttered a thanks, his voice hoarse, and took another sip. The whiskey burned, but it didn't dull the growing sense of dread that gnawed at him. Later that evening, Carter stood at the podium in a packed press conference room. Cameras flashed as reporters jostled for position, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus of questions. Carter raised a hand, calling for silence. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice calm but firm. Tonight we're filing a formal complaint against Officer Jason White for his unlawful actions during a traffic stop last week. But this is not just about one officer. This is about a system that allows and perpetuates misconduct. He gestured to Angela, who stood to his right, holding a stack of documents. Our audit has uncovered patterns of racial profiling, illegal searches, and other abuses of power within this department. We are calling for immediate reforms to ensure accountability and transparency. The room erupted in questions, but Carter held his ground. He knew this moment was bigger than him. It was a turning point, a chance to demand change that went beyond one viral video. Angela stepped forward, fielding questions with her usual poise. Carter glanced at her, grateful for her presence. She had been his anchor throughout this ordeal, guiding him with unwavering conviction. As the press conference ended, Carter felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. The first step had been taken, but the road ahead was still long. He knew the department wouldn't go down without a fight. At the precinct, the fallout from the press conference hit like a bomb. Captain Reardon watched the coverage on the small television in his office, his jaw clenched. He had tried to contain the situation, but the public pressure was mounting, and the department's reputation was on the line. Reardon called an emergency meeting with the internal affairs team, his frustration evident as he paced the room. "We need to get ahead of this," he said. "White is a liability, and if we don't act fast, this whole department is going to be dragged through the mud." One of the internal affairs officers nodded. "We're already reviewing the complaint. Based on what we've seen, there's enough to recommend termination. But we need to tread carefully. This case could set a precedent." Reardon sighed, rubbing his temples. He knew the stakes were high. The department's credibility was hanging by a thread, and Jason White's actions had become a lightning rod for criticism. Jason, unaware of the meeting taking place, sat alone in his apartment. The glow of the television illuminated his haggard face as he watched the press conference replay on the news. Carter's voice echoed in his ears, each word driving a nail deeper into Jason's sense of control. He grabbed the remote and turned off the TV, plunging the room into silence. He couldn't escape the reality of his situation. The walls were closing in, and there was no way out. For the first time, Jason felt the weight of his actions, not just the consequences, but the harm he had caused. He thought about the countless stops he had made, the people he had treated as suspects simply because they didn't fit his narrow view of the world. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. Jason's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He picked it up reluctantly, seeing Mark's name on the screen. He debated ignoring it, but ultimately answered. "White," Mark said, his voice low. "They're going to recommend termination. Reardon's already working on the paperwork." Jason's breath caught in his throat. "What?" "I'm sorry, man," Mark said. "There's nothing we can do. They're making you the fall guy for this." Jason's grip tightened on the phone. "This isn't just me, Mark. You know that." "I know," Mark said. "But someone has to take the blame, and you've got the biggest target on your back." Jason ended the call without another word. He sat in silence, the enormity of his situation sinking in. He had lost his badge, his reputation, and his future. And for what? A moment of arrogance, a refusal to back down when he should have. The next day, Carter received an unexpected call. It was Captain Reardon. "Mr. Jenkins," Reardon said, his tone measured. "I'd like to meet with you to discuss the audit. I believe we can find common ground." Carter was skeptical, but agreed. When they met in a neutral office space later that afternoon, Reardon surprised him with the proposal. "We're ready to make some changes," Reardon said. "But we need your help. If you're willing to collaborate with us, we can implement reforms that address the issues you've uncovered." Carter studied Reardon carefully. The captain's words seemed sincere, but Carter knew better than to trust them completely. "I'll work with you," Carter said finally, "but only if the changes are meaningful. No more empty promises." Reardon nodded. "Agreed." By the end of the week, Jason White received official notice of his termination. The letter was brief, its language clinical, but its message was clear: he was no longer a police officer. As he packed up his belongings, Jason felt a hollow emptiness settle over him. His career was over, and his life as he knew it was gone. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of his reckoning. For Carter, the fight was far from over. The changes Reardon promised were a step in the right direction, but there was still much work to be done. As he stood before another crowd at a community meeting, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This isn't just about fixing one department, Carter said. It's about building a system that serves everyone equally. And that's a fight worth continuing. The room erupted in applause, and Carter felt a surge of hope. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face it one step at a time. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation and tension. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, cameras clicked from the gallery, and the hum of whispered conversations filled the room. All eyes were on the defendant's table, where Jason White sat rigidly, his once confident demeanor replaced by a pale, haunted expression. The charges against him, unlawful access to sealed documents, racial profiling, and misconduct had culminated in this moment. At the other table, Carter Jenkins sat beside Angela Robinson, his presence a reminder of the catalyst that had brought them all here. Unlike Jason, Carter appeared calm, composed, and resolute, his hands resting neatly on the table before him. This was no longer just about his own experience, it was about the broader fight for accountability and reform. The judge entered, her black robe sweeping behind her as she ascended to her seat. The gavel struck, silencing the murmurs in the room. "Court is now in session," she announced. "The People versus Jason White. Counsel, are you ready to proceed?" The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman with a commanding presence, rose first. "The prosecution is ready, Your Honor." Jason's defense attorney, a weary-looking man in a rumpled suit, followed. "The defense is ready, Your Honor." The judge nodded, and the trial began. The prosecution wasted no time laying out its case. They called Angela Robinson to the stand first, her sharp intellect and unwavering confidence on full display. She recounted the events of Carter's traffic stop, her voice steady as she described how Jason had violated protocol by accessing sealed files without a warrant. "We have evidence," Angela said, her gaze sweeping the jury. "That Officer White used his authority not to enforce the law, but to target and intimidate an innocent man. His actions were not only unethical but illegal." The prosecutor presented the damning evidence, Jason's digital trail showing his unauthorized access to the database, coupled with testimony from experts who confirmed the breach. Angela's testimony was bolstered by the video of the traffic stop, which played on a large screen for the jury to see. The room fell silent as Jason's brusque demeanor and racially charged language echoed through the speakers. Carter's turn on the stand came next. He recounted his experience with quiet dignity, his words measured but powerful. He described the humiliation of being treated as a suspect for no reason, the fear that lingered even after the encounter ended, and the anger that fueled his determination to seek justice. "Officer White saw my skin color and made assumptions about who I am," Carter said, meeting the jury's gaze. "But I'm here today to show that those assumptions were wrong, and to ensure that this doesn't happen to anyone else." The defense, meanwhile, struggled to mount a credible case. Jason's attorney attempted to argue that his actions were a result of misguided zeal rather than malice, but the evidence painted a different picture. The prosecutor dismantled each point with precision, leaving little room for doubt. As the trial progressed, Jason sat silently, his mind racing. He felt like a man on the edge of a crumbling cliff, each argument and piece of evidence pushing him closer to the abyss. He had once thought himself untouchable, but now the weight of his actions bore down on him like an anchor. He thought back to the countless stops he had made over the years, the people he had questioned, searched, and detained without cause. At the time, it had felt routine, even justified. But now he saw those moments for what they were: abuses of power, fueled by his own biases and insecurities. For the first time, Jason allowed himself to wonder how many lives he had disrupted, how many people had walked away from his stops carrying the same anger and fear that Carter had described. The realization was like a punch to the gut. The climax of the trial came with the closing arguments. The prosecutor stood before the jury, her voice ringing with conviction. "This case is about more than one man's actions," she said. "It's about a system that allows those actions to go unchecked. Officer White's behavior is not an anomaly, it is a symptom of a much larger problem. But today we have the opportunity to take a stand, to say enough is enough." The defense attorney, in contrast, seemed resigned. His argument was lackluster, his words carrying none of the fire or passion needed to sway the jury. When the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate, the tension in the room was palpable. Carter and Angela exchanged a glance, their unspoken hope shared in that brief moment. Jason, meanwhile, sat staring at the table, his hands clasped tightly as if to keep them from trembling. The jury's deliberation lasted several hours, but it felt like an eternity to everyone in the courtroom. When they finally returned, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The foreman stood, holding a folded piece of paper that held Jason's fate. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman read the verdict. "On the charge of unlawful access to sealed documents, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of racial profiling, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of misconduct, we find the defendant guilty." A collective exhale swept through the room. Carter felt a wave of relief wash over him, though it was tempered by the knowledge that this was only one step in a much larger fight. Jason slumped in his seat, the verdict hitting him like a physical blow. The judge addressed the courtroom. "Officer White's actions represent a serious breach of trust and a violation of the principles that law enforcement is meant to uphold. Sentencing will be scheduled for a later date. Court is adjourned." The gavel struck, and the room erupted into motion. Reporters scrambled to file their stories, while spectators exchanged hushed conversations. Carter turned to Angela, who placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she said. "This is a victory." "It's a start," Carter replied. "But there's still so much work to do." That evening, Carter attended another community meeting, this one packed with supporters eager to celebrate the verdict. The mood was jubilant, but Carter remained grounded. He took the podium and addressed the crowd, his voice carrying both hope and resolve. "Today's verdict is a step forward," he said. "But it's not the end. True justice means more than holding one person accountable. It means changing the system that allowed this to happen. And that's a fight we have to continue together." The crowd erupted in applause, their energy infectious. Carter felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that this moment was bigger than him. It was a movement, a call for change that could no longer be ignored. Jason returned to his empty apartment, the silence almost deafening. The verdict echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of his downfall. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, his thoughts a chaotic tangle of regret and bitterness. For the first time, Jason wondered if he could have been different, if he could have made better choices, seen people like Carter for who they truly were, instead of through the lens of his own prejudice. The thought was painful, but it lingered, refusing to be ignored. Jason White's career was over, but the impact of his actions would ripple outward, a cautionary tale in a time of reckoning. Carter, on the other hand, walked away from the courtroom with his head held high. The fight was far from over, but he knew that together they had taken an important step toward justice, and that was enough to keep him moving forward. The sun set over the city, casting a warm, golden hue on its streets. Life bustled on as usual, the day-to-day rhythm seemingly unaffected by the events of the past few weeks. Yet beneath the surface, a change was brewing, a quiet, persistent undercurrent that hinted at something new, something different. Carter Jenkins walked through the park, his niece clutching his hand. The sounds of laughter and chatter filled the air, children playing on the swings, joggers passing by with headphones on, and families picnicking on the grass. It was a scene of serenity, a momentary reprieve from the chaos of his recent life. But even as he smiled at his niece's excited chatter, his mind lingered on the challenges still ahead. The aftermath of Jason White's trial had rippled across the city and beyond. The verdict had become a rallying point, sparking conversations about police reform and systemic injustice in communities far removed from Carter's own. Civil rights organizations seized the momentum, pushing for policy changes that had long been overdue. Carter had become an unwitting figurehead in this movement. His face was now familiar in city council meetings, community forums, and news segments. People looked to him not just as a victim of injustice, but as a voice of hope and resilience. It was a role he had never sought, but one he embraced nonetheless. At the same time, Jason White's life had unraveled completely. His termination from the police force marked the end of a career that had once given him a sense of power and purpose. Stripped of his badge, Jason found himself grappling with an identity crisis he had spent years ignoring. The house Jason had once prided himself on, a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, now felt empty and cold. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, the utilities threatening to be cut off. His friends from the force had grown distant, unwilling to associate with someone whose name had become synonymous with disgrace. One evening, as Jason sat alone at his dining table, he opened his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before finally typing the words "unconscious bias training." He clicked on the first link, a free seminar being offered at a local community center. He stared at the screen, the cursor blinking, before closing the laptop with a frustrated sigh. But the thought lingered. Could he change? Did he even deserve the chance? Back in the park, Carter's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw Angela's name on the screen. He let his niece play on the jungle gym as he answered the call. "Angela," he greeted, stepping away to a quieter spot. "What's up?" "I just wanted to let you know the city council voted to pass the new police oversight policies," Angela said, her voice tinged with pride. "It's a big win, Carter. They're establishing an independent review board and mandating body cameras for all officers." Carter felt a wave of relief wash over him. "That's incredible news," he said. "It's a step in the right direction." "It is," Angela agreed. "And it wouldn't have happened without you. I hope you know that." Carter hesitated, leaning against a nearby tree. "It wasn't just me, Angela. It was all of us, every person who spoke out, who marched, who demanded change. This is their victory, too." Angela's voice softened. "Still, I hope you're taking a moment to appreciate what you've accomplished. You've made a real difference." Carter glanced at his niece, who waved at him from across the playground. He waved back, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'll try," he said. "Thanks, Angela." That evening, Carter attended another community meeting, this one celebrating the passage of the oversight policies. The room was filled with familiar faces, all of them beaming with pride. Victor Martinez stood at the front, addressing the crowd with a mix of gratitude and determination. "We've achieved something monumental," Victor said. "But this is just the beginning. The fight for justice doesn't end here. It continues every day in every community, and together we'll keep moving forward." The crowd erupted into applause, and Carter felt a swell of pride. When Victor invited him to speak, Carter stepped to the podium, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. "Change is hard," Carter began, his voice steady. "It's slow, and it's painful, and it doesn't happen overnight. But it happens because people like you refuse to give up, because you believe in a better future, not just for yourselves, but for everyone." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "This isn't the end of the fight. It's a new chapter. And I promise you, I'll keep fighting alongside you. For my niece, for her generation. For her generation. For all of us." The room filled with cheers and applause, and for the first time in weeks, Carter allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. The road ahead was long, but he wasn't walking it alone. Several days later, Jason White finally attended the seminar on unconscious bias. The community center was modest, the room small but welcoming. Jason sat in the back, his arms crossed, his expression guarded. He didn't expect much, just another lecture about things he'd heard before. But as the facilitator began to speak, something shifted. The stories she shared weren't just about abstract concepts or statistics. They were about real people, people like Carter Jenkins. For the first time, Jason saw his actions through a different lens. He saw the harm he had caused, the trust he had broken, the lives he had disrupted. And for the first time, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: remorse. When the seminar ended, Jason stayed behind, lingering near the door as the facilitator packed up her materials. Finally, he approached her. "Thank you," he said awkwardly. For this. It was eye-opening." The facilitator smiled warmly. "The first step toward change is recognizing the need for it," she said. "Keep going. It's not an easy journey, but it's worth it." Jason nodded, her words lingering in his mind as he left the building. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time he felt a glimmer of hope. Carter returned home that evening exhausted but fulfilled. As he sat on his couch, scrolling through the day's news, he saw a headline that caught his eye: "Former officer attends bias training, a step toward redemption." The article included a photo of Jason White leaving the community center, his face shadowed but unmistakable. Carter stared at the screen, his emotions a mix of surprise and cautious optimism. He didn't know if Jason could truly change, but the fact that he was trying was a small victory in itself. Carter closed his laptop and leaned back, letting the day's events wash over him. The fight wasn't over, it never would be. But in that moment he felt a sense of clarity, a quiet strength that carried him forward. In the weeks that followed, the city began to implement the new oversight policies. The independent review board was established, community forums were held to foster dialogue, and training programs were introduced to address bias and de-escalation tactics. It was a slow process, but it was progress. Carter continued his work, speaking at events, consulting on reform efforts, and mentoring young activists. He knew the road ahead was long, but he also knew that every step mattered. And as the city moved forward, so did Jason White. He began volunteering at community events, attending more seminars, and even reaching out to colleagues to share what he had learned. It was a small start, but it was a start nonetheless. One evening, months later, Carter stood at the edge of the same park where he had walked with his niece. The city skyline glowed in the distance, a reminder of the work that still lay ahead. As he watched the sunset, he felt a sense of quiet resolve. Change was hard. It was slow, but it was possible. And for that, Carter was willing to keep fighting.